The first crack in the wall appeared in September 2025, when Representative Thomas Macy did something most politicians considered career suicide. He filed a discharge petition to force a vote on the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a move that required him to directly challenge President Donald Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson, two of the most powerful men in Washington, who had been working behind the scenes for months to ensure this bill never saw the light of day, making phone calls to wavering members, applying pressure through party committees, and using every lever of power available to leadership to keep this particular piece of legislation buried in committee where it could die quietly without anyone having to publicly declare whether they supported transparency about Jeffrey Epstein's network of enablers or preferred to keep those secrets locked away forever. Macy, a Kentucky Republican known for bucking his own party on everything from government spending to surveillance powers, understood the math better than most. He needed 218 signatures from House members to bypass leadership entirely, a parliamentary maneuver so rare that most sessions of Congress saw 0 successful discharge petitions, and even attempting one meant declaring war on your own leadership, who controlled committee assignments that determined whether you spent your days on powerful committees like Ways and Means or languished in obscurity on minor subcommittees, who controlled campaign funding that could mean the difference between a competitive race and certain defeat, and who held every lever of power that could make or break a congressional career, from scheduling votes on your bills to whether your amendments even got considered on the floor. But Macy had something that mattered more than Mike Johnson's approval or Donald Trump's endorsement. He had constituent phone calls flooding his office by the thousands every single day, emails crashing his servers with such regularity that his IT staff had to upgrade their systems 3 times in 2 months. Town halls packed with furious parents demanding to know why their government was protecting Jeffrey Epstein's network of powerful enablers who had facilitated decades of abuse, and most importantly, he had survivors like Haley Robson who had spent decades fighting for this moment. Women who had been teenage girls when Epstein victimized them and who refused to let Washington bury the truth any longer, who showed up at congressional offices with their stories and their determination and their absolute refusal to accept another excuse about why now wasn't the right time, or why this needed to be handled quietly, or why protecting the reputations of powerful people mattered more than justice for the girls whose childhoods had been stolen. Trump had initially dismissed the entire effort as a Democrat hoax, his typical strategy of attacking rather than engaging with the substance of an issue, framing it as a political stunt designed to embarrass him and his allies, rather than a legitimate effort to bring transparency to one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. While Johnson argued more carefully that the House Oversight Committee's separate investigation was sufficient, and that forcing a premature release could harm both victims whose privacy needed protection and innocent people whose names appeared in the files simply because they had attended the same events or knew Epstein socially without any involvement in his crimes. An argument that sounded reasonable on its surface, but struck many observers as a convenient excuse to maintain the status quo where powerful people's secrets remained protected behind walls of classification and executive privilege and claims of ongoing investigation. Neither man had anticipated the volcanic pressure building in congressional districts across America, where voters were united in their fury regardless of party affiliation, where Republican voters called their Republican representatives demanding transparency with the same intensity that Democratic voters called their Democratic representatives, creating a rare moment of genuine bipartisan agreement among constituents, even as their elected leaders in Washington remained divided along partisan lines about almost everything else, from immigration to taxes to foreign policy to the very nature of democracy itself. As September turned to October and October bled into early November, Massey watched his signature count climb with agonizing slowness, each number representing not just a signature on a piece of paper, but a member of Congress who had wrestled with their conscience and their political calculations and their party loyalty and ultimately decided that whatever consequences came from defying leadership were worth accepting. 195 signatures by late September, then 203 by early October, then 210 by mid-October, each milestone celebrated quietly by survivors and advocates who understood that every signature brought them closer to forcing a vote, but also knew that the final signatures would be the hardest, because the members who signed first were the true believers and the independents, and those from safe districts where defying leadership carried minimal risk, while the members who remained unsigned were those most vulnerable to pressure from leadership, most dependent on party support for their political survival, most afraid of being punished for breaking ranks on such a high-profile issue. By early November, he stood at 214 signatures, with just 4 more needed to trigger the vote that Trump and Johnson were desperately trying to prevent, and the tension in Washington became palpable as everyone waited to see whether those final 4 signatures would materialize, or whether the effort would stall just short of success, leaving Massey to file the petition again in the next session and start the entire exhausting process over from zero. The turning point came when 4 Republicans, representatives whose names would be remembered for crossing the ultimate red line in Trump's party, men and women who understood that they were likely ending their political careers or at least guaranteeing brutal primary challenges funded by leadership allies, but who made the calculation that some things mattered more than Mike Johnson's approval or Donald Trump's endorsement, signed the petition alongside all 214 Democrats, and suddenly the discharge petition had reached 218 signatures, guaranteeing a floor vote that leadership could no longer stop through procedural maneuvers or scheduling games or quiet pressure. A parliamentary nuclear weapon that had just been detonated in the heart of the Capitol, and that would force every single member of the House to go on record about whether they supported transparency about Epstein's network or preferred to keep those files secret. Trump found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making, backed into a corner by his own earlier opposition and the political momentum that had built to unstoppable levels. Continue opposing a bill that was clearly going to pass anyway with overwhelming bipartisan support and be recorded in history as the president who tried to protect Epstein's secrets even as survivors begged for transparency, or perform a humiliating reversal and pretend he'd supported transparency all along, even though everyone in Washington knew he'd been working against it for months. And over the weekend before the vote, he chose the latter option, posting on Truth Social that House Republicans should vote yes because we have nothing to hide. A reversal so transparent and unconvincing that even his allies rolled their eyes, and political commentators struggled to find anyone willing to defend the president's consistency on the issue. Representative Ray Garcia didn't mince words when reporters asked about Trump's sudden reversal, telling them bluntly that Trump is panicking and noting with barely concealed contempt that the president had the power to release all the files immediately through executive action, but instead wanted to continue this cover-up by opposing legislative transparency. While even Massey, who had generally maintained good relations with Trump despite his independent streak, couldn't resist pointing out that Trump got tired of me winning, a jab that captured the David and Goliath dynamic that had characterized the entire battle between a single determined congressman and the most powerful political figures in the country. On November 18, 2025, the House chamber crackled with unusual electricity as members filed in for a vote that everyone knew would be historic regardless of the outcome, with C-SPAN cameras capturing every moment for the historical record, and journalists from major outlets positioned throughout the press gallery to document what was about to unfold. And in the public gallery above, more than a dozen Epstein survivors clutched photographs of their younger selves, images of the children they had been when their lives were shattered by a predator and the powerful network that enabled him, and waited to see if the most powerful legislative body in America would finally choose transparency over protection of the elite, would finally prioritize justice for victims over the comfort and reputations of those who might be implicated in the files, would finally demonstrate that even the wealthy and connected could be held accountable when their crimes were monstrous enough and the public pressure intense enough and the political moment aligned just right. Representative Ro Khanna's voice shook with barely controlled anger as he addressed the chamber during the floor debate, his prepared remarks giving way to raw emotion as he spoke about what this vote really meant. You had Jeffrey Epstein, who literally set up an island of rape, and you had rich and powerful men who thought they could abuse America's girls with no consequence. Because survivors spoke up, the truth is finally going to come out. Words that echoed through the chamber and reminded everyone present that this wasn't just about documents and transparency and political maneuvering, but about real human beings whose lives had been destroyed and who deserved to finally see accountability for those who had harmed them and enabled that harm. Even Johnson, his face betraying the frustration of a general who had lost a battle he thought he controlled, acknowledged defeat in his own floor remarks and announced he would vote yes, while hoping the Senate would correct the bill's what he called serious deficiencies, a face-saving statement that fooled nobody about his true feelings, but allowed him to claim he'd voted for transparency even as he continued to express reservations about the process and the potential consequences, threading a political needle that might protect him from primary challenges while also allowing him to tell moderate voters that he'd supported releasing the files. When the final tally flashed across C-SPAN screens, 427 to 1, the gallery erupted in a mixture of sobs and cheers, an emotional release of decades of frustration and fighting, and being told to wait just a little longer, to trust the process, to believe that justice would eventually come through proper channels, even as those channels seemed designed to protect the powerful rather than deliver accountability. And Haley Robson, clutching that photograph of her younger self with tears streaming down her face, finally allowed herself to believe that decades of being told to be patient, to trust the system, to let powerful people handle things quietly behind closed doors might actually be ending. That the wall of secrecy that had protected Epstein's network for so long might finally be crumbling. Only Representative Clay Higgins of Louisiana voted no, arguing in his floor remarks that the bill abandoned proper criminal justice procedures and would inadvertently harm innocent people whose names appeared in documents without context or explanation, a principled stand that he maintained, even as it left him isolated and subject to intense criticism from both sides of the aisle, who saw his vote as providing cover for those who wanted to keep the files secret. But his solitary dissent was drowned in the tidal wave of bipartisan support that represented something extraordinary in an era of extreme partisan division, where Republicans and Democrats could barely agree on the time of day. Both parties united overwhelmingly because even Trump's most loyal allies had calculated that opposing transparency on Epstein was political suicide back home in their districts, where voters across the political spectrum were united in demanding answers and accountability. Hours later, as Washington digested the stunning House vote and survivors celebrated in restaurants and hotel bars throughout the city, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer moved with the kind of speed rarely seen in that famously deliberative body where legislation typically moved at a glacial pace and where procedural objections could delay bills for weeks or months, walking onto the Senate floor that same evening and requesting unanimous consent, a
procedure requiring agreement from all 100 senators, where a single objection would kill the bill and send it back to committee or force lengthy floor debate and amendment processes that could take weeks. The House has now spoken in an overwhelming fashion, Schumer declared to his Senate colleagues, his voice carrying throughout the chamber as he made his case for immediate passage. And then the chamber fell into a silence so complete you could hear breathing and the rustling of papers and the quiet footsteps of Senate pages as seconds ticked by with unbearable tension. Any senator having the power to object and derail the momentum that had built throughout the day. But no objection came, because even in the Senate, where political calculation ruled every decision and where senators prided themselves on their independence and their willingness to slow down hasty House legislation, not one member was willing to be recorded as the person who blocked the Epstein files from being released, who stood in the way of transparency and accountability, who gave cover for those who might be implicated in enabling one of the most notorious predators in modern American history. So ordered, the presiding officer announced, and just like that, the bill had passed both chambers of Congress within the same day, a legislative speed that normally took months or years compressed into hours because the political momentum had become unstoppable, because the pressure from constituents had become overwhelming, because even the most powerful politicians in America had calculated that fighting this battle any longer was political suicide back home in their districts, where voters across the political spectrum were united in demanding answers and accountability. Hours later, as Washington digested the stunning House vote and survivors celebrated in restaurants and hotel bars throughout the city, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer moved with the kind of speed rarely seen in that famously deliberative body where legislation typically moved at a glacial pace and where procedural objections could delay bills for weeks or months, walking onto the Senate floor that same evening and requesting unanimous consent, a procedure requiring agreement from all 100 senators, where a single objection would kill the bill and send it back to committee or force lengthy floor debate and amendment processes that could take weeks. The House has now spoken in an overwhelming fashion, Schumer declared to his Senate colleagues, his voice carrying throughout the chamber as he made his case for immediate passage. And then the chamber fell into a silence so complete you could hear breathing and the rustling of papers and the quiet footsteps of Senate pages as seconds ticked by with unbearable tension. Any senator having the power to object and derail the momentum that had built throughout the day. But no objection came, because even in the Senate, where political calculation ruled every decision, and where senators prided themselves on their independence and their willingness to slow down hasty House legislation, not one member was willing to be recorded as the person who blocked the Epstein files from being released, who stood in the way of transparency and accountability, who gave cover for those who might be implicated in enabling one of the most notorious predators in modern American history. So ordered, the presiding officer announced, and just like that, the bill had passed both chambers of Congress within the same day. A legislative speed that normally took months or years compressed into hours because the political momentum had become unstoppable, because the pressure from constituents had become overwhelming, because even the most powerful politicians in America had calculated that fighting this battle any longer was political suicide. The next morning, November 19, a senior White House official confirmed what everyone already knew when reporters pressed for the president's position. The bill will be signed whenever it gets to the White House. A statement delivered with resignation rather than enthusiasm, because Trump faced simple mathematics that even his most loyal advisers couldn't spin away. With 427-1 in the House and unanimous consent in the Senate, any veto would be overridden immediately and publicly within hours, making signing it simply the less embarrassing option for a president who prided himself on never admitting defeat and who hated being forced into corners where his only choices were bad and worse. The legislation itself was straightforward and uncompromising in its language, drafted specifically to prevent the kind of loopholes and exceptions that had kept these files secret for years. The Department of Justice had 30 days from the date of signing to release all unclassified records, documents, communications, and investigative materials related to Jeffrey Epstein and his co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell, with protections only for victims identifying information that could lead to harassment or exposure, and material depicting child sexual abuse that would violate federal law to release. But the law specifically prohibited the DOJ from withholding documents due to embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity, language designed to prevent exactly the kind of protection that had kept these files secret for years and that would theoretically force the release of damaging information about powerful people regardless of their positions or connections.
Attorney General Pam Bondi now confronted an enormous and daunting task that would consume her department for the next month. Files scattered across the FBI field offices, DOJ litigation files, Treasury Department financial crime databases, and potentially intelligence agencies that had monitored Epstein's international connections had to be compiled, reviewed for the limited exceptions allowed under the law, redacted appropriately to protect victims and remove classified information, and prepared for public release by December 19, 2025, a deadline that was rapidly approaching as journalists assembled research teams to analyze what would likely be tens of thousands of pages. Lawyers for powerful individuals nervously awaited potential revelations that could destroy careers and reputations, and survivors hoped for vindication and answers about who had enabled Epstein's crimes for so long, who had looked the other way, who had provided resources and access and protection to a man whose predatory behavior was an open secret among certain circles of the wealthy and powerful. But even in victory, even as survivors celebrated and advocates declared a historic triumph for transparency, shadows of doubt lingered about whether this would truly deliver the accountability that had been promised. Because just days before the vote, Trump had ordered Bondi to launch an investigation into Epstein's connections to three prominent Democrats: former President Bill Clinton, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and tech investor Reid Hoffman. And some members of Congress worried this could become a loophole, since the bill allowed withholding materials that would jeopardize an active federal investigation, provided such withholding was narrowly tailored and temporary. Language that could theoretically be manipulated to protect allies while exposing enemies, to turn what should be a comprehensive release into a selective one that served political purposes rather than the cause of justice. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska captured both the triumph and the lingering uncertainty when she issued a statement about the bill's passage. "We need to enforce transparency and integrity at the highest levels of government. It's past time that all involved in Epstein's illegal operation be brought to justice, so the survivors of these awful crimes can have closure." But her words carried an implicit question that many were asking. Would the release actually deliver that closure, or would it become another chapter in Washington's endless capacity for partial truths and strategic omissions, where damaging information about some people emerged, while equally damaging information about others remained conveniently classified or withheld under exemptions that seemed designed more for political protection than legitimate security concerns? As December approached and the deadline loomed large on everyone's calendars, Washington braced for impact with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, understanding that November 18, 2025 had marked one of those rare moments when public pressure, survivor advocacy, and congressional power aligned perfectly to force transparency over the objections of the executive branch.
a victory that represented years of fighting by women like Haley Robeson, who had refused to let their trauma be buried for the convenience of powerful men, who had testified before committees and spoken to reporters and organized rallies and done everything possible to keep pressure on a political system that seemed designed to protect the elite rather than deliver justice to victims, but also understanding that the real test would come on December 19th, when the world would finally see whether the truth emerging from those files would lead to genuine accountability or simply reveal how deep the protection of the powerful truly ran. Whether names would be named and connections exposed and the full scope of Epstein's network finally revealed, or whether redactions and exceptions and claims of national security would leave the most important questions unanswered and the most powerful enablers unaccountable, leaving everyone to wonder in these final weeks whether the 427-1 vote was the end of a cover-up or just the beginning of learning exactly how much had been hidden and who had been complicit in keeping it secret for so long. Whether this moment of apparent transparency would actually deliver the justice that survivors had fought for, or whether it would become just another chapter in the long history of powerful people escaping consequences for their actions, while the vulnerable paid the price for speaking truth to power.